What happens when you're too aggressive in trying to seize the initiative and you sacrifice concentration of force to generate tempo? We look at Colonel Ichiki at the Battle of the Tenaru, or Alligator Creek.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
This episode, number 138 of The Principles of War, looks at how the Marines defended Henderson Field as they were attacked by the Ichiki detachment across the Alligator Creek. We are joined once again by our expert on the Guadalcanal campaign, Dave Holland. Let's get right into the next battle in the Guadalcanal campaign. Alrighty, welcome back to the podcast, Dave.
Thanks, James, and great to be back. And once again, now we're on the ground fighting, so yeah, I'm in my element now.
So last week we talked about the Getchi Patrol. How did the Marines respond after the Getchi Patrol's elimination?
Okay, so obviously it was a big shock to the division, especially finding the remains of the Getchi Patrol. Once the information started coming back, they'd found the original garrison they were looking for. They said, well, this is the stronghold, the Matanical, and this is probably where the original garrison went to, the majority of them, apart from some of the construction workers aimlessly wandering in the jungle. But the main strength, the main element is there. So Vandergriff, division commander, said, okay, now we've located them. This is our chance to destroy them and wipe out the original garrison on the island. That way we'll have the island to ourselves and we can secure the airfield better. So they wouldn't call it a punitive expedition, but then again, I will call it a punitive expedition because the regimental commander, Hunt, of the 5th Marines, had been tasked to go and eliminate that threat or eliminate the stronghold. And haven't seen it written down, but there was a number of accounts basically saying there'd be no prisoners taken on this one. And I think Hunt, one of his comments was go down and kill every one of the last bastards there, kill every one of them. So that was their intent, was to wipe the garrison out and literally wipe it out. They basically said, look, they're taking no prisoners, so fine. We'll take no prisoners and we'll play it that way. So the plan was on the 18th of August, they were going to send 3 companies down. So one company was going to go down to the mouth of Matanical and hold there and be a diversion force. Another one was going to cross about 2,000 yards upstream in Matanical. So the Japanese had a bridge called the One Log Bridge, and we'll discuss it quite a number of times throughout the podcast. And basically it wasn't a one log bridge. It was actually 2 logs. They didn't call it a 2-log bridge. The Japanese actually called it Nippon Bridge. This guy has saying Japanese because I don't speak Japanese. But anyway, it was basically covering, at the base of Hill 65, it covered a narrow part of the river. So it was a makeshift constructed bridge. Anyway, one company was going to cross there on the 18th, and then they were going to go up to Hill 75, which was on the west bank. The Japanese had dug in along the Matanical. Last week we discussed the pre-war village there, and they had their defenses built around that. So they had an L shape around the mouth of Matanical on the west bank. So one company was going to hold, another company was going to come around and hit them in the flank, which would be the southern flank of the Japanese right flank. And another company was going to get an amphibious assault at a place called Kukumbana, which is about 3 miles to the west. So they're going to land at Kukumbana and advance back to the east to trap the Japanese. So one was holding, one was flanking, one was coming in the rear. So on the 18th, they sent the first company, which is L Company 35. So they crossed up the Matanical. They're in position. So Bravo 15 was on or B Company. They didn't call him Bravo. They didn't call him Baker. I get in trouble for using the NATO phonetic alphabet to keep it nice and simple. So B15, and then I think I Company was going to land. So cut a long story short, both companies attacked. B couldn't get across mouth of Matanical, but the Lima Company, or L Company, was able to assault through a village, and they trapped the Japanese. And they basically wiped the Japanese out to the man like they promised. So that was the original garrison had been basically eliminated apart from a few stragglers. So at the same time, so this was on the 19th of August, remember. So now I think that brings us up to the next part we're going to discuss today, which is Battle of the Tenaru, the Battle of Alligator Creek. So listeners, just hold that in your thought process right now. Vandergriff and the high command or division command says, okay, now we've eliminated the threat of the garrison, and they were going to actually send another reinforced company the day after and just clean up the remnants. So that's where we're setting now. Then it brings us up to Alligator Creek.
And so now it's the Japanese turn. How did they respond to the Marine landings?
Well, we discussed earlier how they responded through the air and naval. So obviously we had airstrikes and we had the Battle of Savo Island. So the Marines were expecting a major Japanese counteroffensive through the land, amphibious assault. So they started preparing their defenses mainly for a seaborne attack. So the main threat was seaborne attack. So that's where they focused their main defenses with 37 millimeter anti-tank guns for anti-boat defenses. They had 50 caliber heavy machine guns, had a 30 calibers. They had infantry companies lined up. They refused to both flanks on the east and west. On the west, it was at Cucumbana, a place called Cucumbana. Oh, sorry, get my Cucumbanas and Cucum, a lot of Cucum. I know it started with a Cucum. Anyway, yeah, at the west at Cucum, and on the east at the Ilu River, or at that time they had mispronounced it or mislabeled it the Tenaru River. And then imagine a horseshoe shape, so that's their defenses. And then the backside, they covered it with outposts from the amphibious tractor battalion, the engineer battalion, and the pioneer battalion had outposts scattered around with roving patrols in between. So the main threats they thought was from the front and to the flanks. So that's how they responded, and they were preparing themselves for the eventual Japanese counterattack from amphibious assault.
And so where did the Japanese land then? And what was their plan?
All right, so the Japanese, they recognized immediately that the strategic value of that airfield. So they knew they had to retake it as soon as possible. The issue they had, like Vanderbilt said, you can't bomb the Marines out. You got to go and physically take them with ground troops. So trying to find ground troops was pragmatic for the Japanese, because the Japanese Imperial Army, you read some reports that they wasn't aware that the Navy was actually on Guadalcanal, which is false. I mean, a lot of the Army didn't, but a lot of the Navy didn't either. But the Japanese high commands knew the operation, because once again, we talk about Operation FX, where they're going to invade Fiji and Samoa, and they had the whole 17th Army earmarked for that, and one of the staging bases for the air support was Guadalcanal. So they were aware of it, but they didn't have the forces nearby to have an immediate counterattack. The forces they did have were going into New Guinea, Port Moresby. That was the main strategic goal of the Japanese at the time. So the 17th Army, under Hayakitake, Lieutenant General Hayakitake, had based in Rabaul. So he was commanding the New Guinea operation. That was his main focus. They were gathering forces to go into New Guinea. For example, they had the 35th Brigade under Major General Kawaguchi, and they were based in the Palaus, which were later, in some of the Marine listeners or some of the people might know of a battle called Peleliu, which is in Palau. You would see later, unfortunately, in the war. But they were based there. You had another unit called the 4th Infantry Regiment, an Elba Detachment, and they were part of the 2nd Division. And they were actually in the Philippines at the time. And you had another regiment called the 28th Regiment, and they were on the way back to Japan. They were a guy called Kiona. I'm probably mispronouncing his first name. I always mispronounce the Japanese first name, but Colonel Ichiki, or Iki, some people refer to him. He was a colonel. He was the regimental colonel. So they had been designated to invade and occupy Midway, assault Midway and occupy it, but that didn't go down, so they were on the way back to Japan. So they were the only forces really in the nearby they could use. But when I said nearby, you got one in the Philippines, you got one going back to Japan, you got another in the Palaus, hundreds and hundreds of miles away. They had some, I think, 2 battalion strength special naval landing forces units they could use out of Rabaul. But once again, they're not that strong to take back the island. So that was what the Japanese had available to take it back.
What do we know about Ichiki? What kind of a commander was he? What was his history?
Okay, Ichiki of the 28th Regiment. Yeah, Ichiki's a very interesting guy. He first came, I guess, to note during the Marco Polo incident. I think what was that, 39? No, 37.
37.
Yeah, it was. It's 37. So we won't go into Marco Polo incident. I encourage the listeners or viewers to check that out, because it's quite interesting how that started. But I was 2 conflicting reports, either the company commander or battalion commander. I know he was a major, so I'd say potentially he's battalion commander. So he was the guy on the ground that ordered this to go down with the Marco Polo incident, with the attacking of the Chinese, and potentially started, well, it did. It initiated the 1937 Sino-Japanese War. I'm not an expert in that. I mean, there's others who can tell you that. But yeah, he was the guy on the ground responsible for that, who gave the orders. And Ichiki was what you'd expect. He'd been through the Japanese military academies. He fought in China. He was very well versed as an instructor. I mean, I know he instructed a few times at the infantry school, commanding staff college, and a few other specialist courses. He was reported to be a very good switched-on commander, hence why he was picked to lead the assault on Midway. And his regiment was a highly trained regiment, had some great soldiers in it, great equipment. They were considered shock troops, or some of the top in the IJA, or Imperial Japanese Army at the time.
Well, I think some of his troops had actually fought in Nomonhan as well. So significant combat experience.
Yeah, that's going to come to fruition in the Battle of Alligator Creek, because in Nomonhan, as we know, that was fought in 1939. That was the first defeat, real defeat of the Japanese Imperial Army. They destroyed the whole division, the Soviets did, and just wiped the whole Japanese division out. The 28th Regiment was there. And like you said, some of his people who participated in this Battle of Alligator Creek was actually there. I know at least 2 company commanders and some of the senior NCOs. So they were versed on modern combined arms. They understood tanks. They understood artillery. In fact, I think some of the Japanese doctrine changed from Nomonhan when they started putting more artillery and some tanks and stuff to support, because they were outclassed. They realized the power of a combined military arms, which is the Soviets hit them quite hard. So they'd learned those lessons. But Ichiki, remember, wasn't there. So he's about to learn a lesson very shortly. In the let's just say he's about to learn his first and last lesson on modern combat arms.
Do you want to describe the terrain around the area, so Alligator Creek and the Tenaru River?
It was flat. I think we discussed earlier in the first episode how the terrain of Guadalcanal is. Here we wasn't dealing with the grass-covered coral kunai grass hills, which you'd find a lot, or even the thick jungles. What we're dealing here is what they were experiencing was the coconut plantations, nice flat coconut plantations, and interspersed with some thick jungle, mainly around the rivers. There were 3 or 4 rivers, small rivers. So where exactly you were talking about again? Between Alligator Creek?
Where Ichiki's going to fight, where he's going to...
Yeah, when they land at Tabu Point, which is 20 miles to the east of Alligator Creek, or the perimeter, sorry. So they're basically advancing through coconut plantations, nice flat terrain. Initially, when they started, they had to cross a few rivers, and there wasn't an established road. And then once, probably about 2 or 3 miles in, they hit the coastal track, or the government track, and that was a nice flat road. It basically followed the coast through the coconut plantations. So it was designed to service the coconut plantations. So it had a fairly easy walk there. And then when they approached the Tenaru, Tenaru is about a mile, 1,800 meters, so it's a little more than a mile east of Illa River, Alligator Creek. So they had to cross a couple of rivers and creeks. But yeah, it was a pretty flat, easy track for them.
So what intelligence did the Japanese planners have about the American dispositions? What was Ichiki expecting to find as he advanced?
That's a good one. I always like answering this question. And when I was writing my book and doing a lot of research on that, I was starting to find a lot of good information on that about how the Japanese and what they're thinking. And it was kind of contradicting some of the other information I read previously. It just wasn't there. And you think the Japanese went in this blindly and they weren't thinking, but they were. They were thinking. They were trying to use the best intelligence they could. Because you got to remember, you had the regional garrison. They had a real super radio that talked to Mars, so to speak. But they had good quality stuff. But they'd lost the communications, because remember, the Marines had overran at Cookham, overran their radio station and took their base, so they were out communications. So Japanese were scrambling to try to find intelligence. They were trying to say, okay, well, our guys on the ground are human intelligence. The garrison, we're not getting anything from them. So they come up with some pretty interesting and pretty cool ways to communicate. So Captain Monson was the Japanese garrison commander. So the Japanese had coastwatchers too. A lot of people don't know this, but Japanese had coastwatchers, or quote, signal stations, and they'd previously put some on each end of the island, and they had the semaphore flags, and they had the spotting scopes and things, and they were the lookouts. So what the Japanese submarines did, they sent a number of submarines, and I think some of your listeners might have known that opening of the campaign, there was a lot of Japanese submarines popping up and using their deck guns and shooting at Marines, and you had one Marine firing the mortar rounds at them, and you had those 75 millimeters shooting at them, and there's all kind of cool stories there. But what the Japanese submarines were doing, they were collecting intelligence. That was the main thing they were doing, to find out what was going on. And the way they were collecting intelligence, they would pop up, and they'd see if they could look for any activity of the Americans there. And the way they were communicating with the original garrison, they would go off the coast, and they were using semaphore flags, the signal flags, and they were signaling reports back. Then obviously the submarines would either take it back or they'd radio it back. The Japanese were also doing aerial reconnaissance flights, trying to find out what's going on. What they were seeing, they knew there was a large transport fleet there on the 7th to the 9th. And they figured, well, there's a lot of Americans were on these transports. At least in the intelligence said at least a Marine division of 10,000 men. They reckon it was 10,000 Marines there. But due to the Battle of Savo Islands and the transports left on the 9th, their intelligence, based on Imperial Japanese Army, they would say, well, if it was us, we would be able to offload this amount of troops. So they figured, well, the Americans probably offloaded about 3 to 4, maybe 5,000 troops. But then they've jumped back into the ships, and they've left, and they've stranded this one group. Now, how many are there? So when the planes are flying over, there's one plane reported that the Americans seemed listless and demoralized, seen a few boats moving around, seen some supplies, but didn't really see many guys moving around. Because remember, they're all under the coconuts grow. So I've got some aerial photos of the 8th and 9th and 10th, and there's a whole Marine division there, and you can't see any. You just seen a few trucks on the beaches, and that's it. So anyway, they reported back, and the 8th Fleet, or 8th, I think, intelligence group out of Rabaul, I think they flew, yeah, they did. One staff officer flew over, and he reported, he goes, I think there was only about 2,000 or 3,000 Americans there. There was a major general, he said, I forgot his name, but he said, no, I think there's about 7,000 there. And he was kind of overruled. So ballpark figure, they come up, at least there's about 3,000. Roughly 3,000 Americans there, dispirited, stranded. They're just waiting for the fleet to come back and pick them up. So that was their intelligence they had. They also had some guys, remember, on the ground, the original garrison, giving them some reports back through the semaphore flags, but it wasn't that great. But yeah, that was the intelligence they had at the time. So it wasn't that great. So there was...
Ichiki at this stage doesn't even have his entire regiment, does he? So what sort of combat team, battle group, what is it that he's got that he's advancing to contact with?
Okay, so they're not on the island yet. So basically he gets, like I said before, they're en route back to Japan. So they get these orders real quick. Okay, stop all movement, go to Guam. Like, okay, so they went to Guam for a few days, don't offload. Now, your orders are to proceed the truck. So they proceeded the truck. Once he got the truck, then they were given the plans. Okay, you're going to take 6 fast destroyers. We're limited to the amount of spaces we've got. We're going to do it in 2 echelons. So what Ichiki did, he picked the first echelon. So he stripped down the companies down to, I think, about 80 guys each. They picked the best troops they had. They left their heavy weapons back, so the anti-tank guns, and had some 75 millimeter mountain howitzers guns, the larger guns, artillery pieces. So they've left them back. They were going to be the second echelon. They were going to come in by transport, not fast destroyers, because they couldn't get all that on fast destroyers. So they loaded 914, some people say 914, 917. Let's just say 900. They loaded 900 guys in these 6 destroyers. They took 8 heavy machine guns, 2 70 millimeter infantry guns, portable, and they're very much stripped down. They had like 3 or 4 days of rations. So that was what they were stripped down. They were going to put them on the island first. So Ichiki's orders, and this is another controversial point, he didn't have a direct orders. His orders were basically to land, proceed to the perimeter or outside the airfield, do one of 2 things. If he thought he could attack and take the airfield back, or preferably, which the Japanese wanted to do, but they didn't say, this is what we want you to do. We're going to leave the option up to you. But preferably, you're going to hold and wait for the second echelon, and you're going to wait for the 35th Brigade under Kawaguchi, who would be landed 2 weeks later, or a week later. That was the intent. In the meantime, if you're going to hold, you're going to, I forgot the exact wording, but harass and perform guerrilla-style tactics to delay the building or the completion of the airfield. So that was his orders. So Ichiki, the guy he was, basically boasted I think I forgot the Major General's name, when he said he thought he was a bit shocked. Ichiki basically said, okay, I'm going to take the airfield back, and do you want me to take Tulagi also? Real boastful, very arrogant and boastful. And the Japanese Major General had concerns about that. But once again, no one's directing him, no, you're going to hold. That was the order from the 17th Army under Hayakatake. That was his order, because he was placed under Hayakatake's army at that stage. So, yeah, they were en route to land, and they were going to land on the night of the 19th of August.
So he's certainly aggressive, but interestingly enough, leaving his heavy weapons behind. So one wonders what he's really thinking he's going to be finding.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, once again, he's left that behind. And that goes to say that, he's a rash decision. He just said, they've never been defeated. We'll just push through. This is dispirited. We've defeated dispirited enemy before. There's 3,000, and they're supposed to be scattered around this basically 5-mile perimeter, or 5 miles. The whole perimeter is 15 miles. They'll be so spread out, and that's what he said. We'll hit them with an iron fist, or sweep them aside with a iron glove. I think that's what he said. I'm paraphrasing now. Basically, sweep them aside with an iron glove, because it was just hit them at a fixed point. And Japanese infiltration techniques go straight through, go around, they'll run, or they'll just surrender.
It is interesting, though, when you put it in the context, though, the Japanese advance had been brilliantly executed and incredibly successful. Do we know where he fought during the advance after Pearl Harbor?
No, I don't think he hadn't been engaged. The 28th there was only China.
Yep.
And I don't know exactly where they were. I don't even think they were in garrison yet, but they weren't engaged. Say, for example, like the other regiments that went to Guadalcanal, the 2nd Division and the 38th Division, these guys had been fighting in the Philippines, had fought in Hong Kong, had fought into the Dutch East Indies, but not the 28th. I'm pretty sure of that. Maybe mistaken, but I'm pretty sure that they hadn't had combat experience so far in the war.
So after Ichiki lands, the Marines are working with Martin Clemens and his team of local scouts. What sort of patrolling are they doing? What sort of early warning are the Marines hoping to get?
Yeah, so you had Martin Clemens and his scouts. So Clemens at that stage had joined the division and become part of Division D2 of the intelligence with his scouts. So they started then working for Lieutenant Colonel Buckley, who had been thrust in a position after Getty had been killed. Buckley was the R2 intelligence officer, 11th Marines artillery. Next minute, okay, you're heading the whole divisions are intel, so he's thrown straight in there in the deep end. But anyway, Clemens had started working for Buckley, and they were sending patrols out. A lot of patrols were mainly running to the east, because that was where a lot of his scouts had originated from. They knew that area, so they're running patrols in there. Some of the information is coming back at a place called Taivu, which is 20 miles east of the perimeter, and I talked about these the Japanese coastwatchers and lookout stations. Apparently, the intel was coming back from the scouts, so it was a Japanese radio station or a Japanese lookout point at Taivu, which there was. They marked the beaches later, but there was the intelligence coming back from there. There was some Japanese there, and at the same time they were running some patrols to the west, but mainly to the east. So that was what they were doing out there, running patrols, scouts. Sometimes they're running by themselves or small teams of 3 and 4.
Which leads us to the famous story of Vouza and the patrol that he was in.
Jacob Vouza, or Sir Jacob Vouza now, probably most famous Solomon Islander. He was a pre-war British Solomon Island Protectorate police officer. He was a sergeant major, and he retired. I think at his stage he was 42, because he was born in 1900. So he was 42 years old. He just retired. He mainly served all his time in Malaita, which is the island just north of the Solomons, or it's the Solomon Islands, north of Guadalcanal, sorry. And he'd returned to his village in 1942. And his village is at Titeri, which is out that area. It's probably 11 miles east of the perimeter. So he'd started working for Martin Clemens, because Clemens had picked a lot of the former police officers to be his scouts. They're better trained, and plus he knew them, and he trusted most of those guys. So that's what he wanted, the ones he could trust. So Vouza was one of his scouts. So Vouza was out patrolling around the Titeri area. So on the early mornings of the 19th, the Japanese had landed. Ichiki and his guys had landed, and they'd started moving down in that area. And they'd captured Vouza roughly at one stage. I think we're getting probably a little bit ahead of the brush patrol. I guess, the timing, if you want to talk about the brush patrol first.
Yeah, let's talk about that one.
Okay, so we'll hold Vouza there. So Vouza's at Tenaru. We'll just leave him there for the moment. So the brush patrol, like I said before, the intelligence was coming back. There was a Japanese radio station at Taivu Point. So Brush was Captain Brush. His first name escapes me now, but he was the company commander of A Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. So what Brush was tasked, he took a reinforced patrol, about 60 guys. They had machine guns and some mortars, 60 mils, and some medium machine guns with them. And they were tasked on the 19th to head to Taivu Point and to do reconnaissance and force and destroy that radio station at Taivu Point. So remember, on the 19th, early morning 19th, Ichiki and his guys landed. So they're heading to the west, and you got Brush and his patrol now heading to the east. So around Coley Point, which is 9 miles away from the perimeter, what Ichiki had done, he'd sent a forward party, I think about 35 guys, and he had 5 officers and the rest enlisted. They were actually guided, and this is another interesting point, you don't read in a lot of accounts. They were being guided by 2 of the members of the regional garrison. Because remember, the regional garrison had been there for about 4 weeks at that stage. Not more than that, about 5 weeks. Anyway, they'd been there, so they knew the area. So they'd met, and they'd scattered everywhere. But you had 2 of the Special Naval Landing troops, and they were guiding the Ichikis down. So 2 of them guided these small group reconnaissance party. Their job was to move forward. And they had engineers with them. They had, like I said, they had 5 officers, their intelligence. And they were going to move forward and scout the Marine positions. So they're moving. They ran straight into the brush patrol. So brush patrol got to jump on them, ambushed them, and killed the majority of them. But this was the first time they'd come across Imperial Japanese Army. So they had a look at them. They go, well, these guys are not the stragglers we've been dealing with. These are not the Navy we've been dealing with. These guys are wearing fresh uniforms. They're fresh-looking troops. They got the Imperial Japanese Army star on their helmets. These are the reinforcements they were talking about. Some of the Marine intelligence had mentioned that because, once again, it goes back to the Ultra or the Magic code intercepts readings, because Vandegrift had received about a day before, look, Japanese potentially going to land a unit there to do a counterattack. So they're on the lookout for these guys too, potentially. But now they found them. Anyway, the intelligence got back. The Marines buried the dead. They had 3 dead. Unfortunately, they're still there to this day, missing. They buried them, moved back, reported it. Then that alerted Vandegrift and the rest of the division. Okay, now we know they're coming. They'd already started beefing up the right-hand side of the east side around Ilu River. Okay, well, I'll just call it Alligator Creek. So around that side anyway. So it started beefing it up with 37 millimeter anti-tank guns, machine guns, putting in some wire and things like that. So they started preparing. But now they confirmed the Japanese were here and they're on the move. Now, how the Ichiki reacted to that, information, there were some survivors. They'd made it back and said, our advanced party got wiped out. So that really shocked Ichiki. So what he did, he formed a company real quick, the 1st company, and sent them straight down to rescue them or the survivors. Anyway, they found their dead. They buried their dead, along with the 3 Marines, because it was dark when they got there, and they found 3 larger men wrapped in ponchos, larger than the rest of the Japanese, and they found out, well, these are American Marines. They buried them all. So then Ichiki, at that stage, had the other companies moving, so they're on the move. They're heading that way to the Alligator Creek. So they're not going to stop. And
then
goes back to Vouza.
Yes.
Okay, now, so at that stage, they had captured Vouza during that day. They'd captured him patrolling around his own village. So what they did, now, Vouza was apparently, depends on who you speak to, we haven't verified this yet, but Vouza was apparently carrying an American flag on his person that day he'd rescued an American flyer previously, and the American flyer gave him that flag. No, I think it was actually I got to take that back. I don't know when the American flyer, I think he was actually dealing with on Invasion Day when the American flyers were shot down. I don't think so. I'll have to double check that one. But anyway, basically the report is he's got a flag on it. He got it from an American flyer, and apparently the Japanese, it caught him, and it triggered him. Whether that's true or not, I don't think Vouza is going to be running around doing scouting behind lines with a flag wrapped around him or a flag in his pocket. That's just my opinion, knowing the way Vouza was. But anyway, they captured him, and potentially someone identified him as a scout for the Marines. So they tied him to a tree, tied him with an ant nest at one stage. It beat him up quite severely, They slashed him with a sword, tried to get him to talk. Apparently he didn't say a word. And at that stage, what they did was they untied him from the tree. His hands were still bound. They said, fine, you're going to guide us there. Now, this goes against the common story that Jacob Vouza was tied to a tree, beaten. He wouldn't give any information, so they stabbed him repeatedly with a bayonet, left him to die, and they took off. And then at that stage, Vouza was, this is the known story, it's in all the books, then he was supposed to chew through his hands, the bindings on his hands, escape from the tree, bleeding profusely. And you got to remember, where he was tied to a tree is 11 miles away from Alligator Creek. Then he was supposed to move 11 miles past the Japanese who were moving route march, bleed profusely, about half dead, make it to the Marines only minutes before the Japanese arrived, to the unsuspecting Marines, and tell them the Japanese are coming, which saved hundreds of Marines. Well, that's the story that it's commonly told, but that's not the true, correct story. And this story, that the version I'm telling, is the one that Vouza tells, Martin Clemens tells, a number of other tales, his family tells. It's been verified. The Marines at the time, the intelligence reports all point to this version. It's a more believable version. The version that I think is the true version, after Vouza was bleeding, hands still bound, he led the Japanese. And then when they were getting close to Alligator Creek, the first shots rang out from the outpost. Vouza says, at that stage, the Japanese became very angry, and they stabbed me several times with a bayonet. I fell to the ground, so the Japanese got down beside me because of seeking cover. He said they thought I was dead. They rose up and proceeded on. He said that stage, I crawled off, and then I ran down the bank of the Alligator Creek, and he went about 700 yards, and there he crossed. If you ever go to Guadalcanal, there's a bridge there now, and he crossed roughly in the area, and he was challenged by a guy called Private Brewery. Basically said, don't move, you son of a bitch, I'll kill you. And he goes, me no Japman, me Vouza, or me friend. He says, come in. So they get Vouza in. I take Vouza to the CP, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Command Post. He gives his report. No, I take it back. He doesn't give his report at that stage. He's bleeding out, and he says he wants to see Clemens, Martin Clemens. So they go get Clemens. They said, we got one of your guys here. Clemens goes to him. Vouza gives his report like a good scout, and he says there's at least 2,000 Japanese coming this way. And he goes, okay. And he says, quite, I wouldn't say funny, well, it is kind of funny. And then Vouza, remember, he's bleeding out, half dead, and they're trying to make him as comfortable as possible. They haven't given him first aid because they thought he's about to die. He gives his report. So Clemens says, well, I'll be there in his last moments. And he goes, can you take my last will, testimony? He goes, yeah, I will. And he's writing it down. And Vouza goes, can you leave Aunt so-and-so this and Uncle so-and-so and this? And he goes on for about 5 minutes, just talking. And he goes, well, maybe Vouza's not as hurt as we think he is. So he calls some corpsmen over, and they grab him and take him to the Battalion A station. And I've got the corpsman's account. So this is the first time they ever did a 3-way blood transfusion on anyone in the division. So he said, we put 2 lines in his arm and 1 in his leg, and 3 blood transfusions going at the same time. And you know what's so amazing about this guy? 2 weeks later, he's back on his feet running patrols. And Vouza used to joke, I'm half American, because they put all that blood in, all the American blood in. That's the correct Vouza version, which is more highly believable than the other one. So, yeah, so that was Vouza. So we're back to Ichiki and his group moving down, about to make contact with the Marines. Because remember, the Marines have boosted up their defenses, and plus they've had outposts. They've had outposts to Tenaru. So it's about between Alligator Creek and the real Tenaru River is roughly about a mile. So they've had outposts out to a mile, that far out. So they've got Marine outposts waiting for them because they knew they're coming. So they're waiting for them. It's at night when the first elements kind of meet.
So Ichiki's got his lead elements in contact. How does he proceed? What's his plan?
Yeah, so at this stage, Nakagawa River thinks what's what the Japanese actually had, the Ila River, Nakagawa River. So the Nakagawa River was going to be their assembly point before they moved into the line of departure. They were going to attack the former construction unit camp, which is another 500 or 600 meters to the west near the airfield. They didn't know the Americans were that far up Alligator Creek. They had reports, and some of the documents they captured showed some of the defenses. We read some accounts that they showed individual machine gun positions, which is not true. They showed the American defenses in that horseshoe shape. But the defenses really didn't cover all of Alligator Creek. It showed some elements around Alligator Creek. What they were going to do is right before they got to the east side, that was going to be their assembly point, and they were going to move from there. So they didn't expect Americans that far east. Now, the first elements, Ichiki's not even with the first elements. They're moving in columns. Ichiki's like he's like, you got the lead company, second company. Ichiki's in the middle. So you got two whole companies of Japanese in front of him moving in column. So Ichiki's not even there in the front elements. So the forward elements, this is at night, remember. The first platoon moves in. They encounter the outpost. Outposts fire them up. They see the outpost, and they proceed after the outpost. And they see the outpost run across the sandbar, which is Alligator Creek sandbar. Now, remember, the sandbar is roughly 100 feet long, 50 foot wide at the time. So 100 feet by 50. So that's the sandbar. And that was the area where the coastal road crossed the river. With the coastal road, they generally did that high tide, the sandbars, and they could drive over them. Anyway, they crossed the sandbar, and they seen him run across. And he thought, the lead, this is the platoon commander, he goes, well, I'm not going to advance because I'll wait for my company commander to come up and see what's going on before I advance. Company commander comes up. He goes, we think there's the Americans over there. He goes, okay, first platoon, go across. Remember, Ichiki's not even there yet. First platoon goes across, and they get hit pretty hard. 37 millimeter anti-tank gun, machine guns, man. They had a 50 cal and a 37 right on the sandbar. But then you had 30 cals and up and down the river, enfiladed fire. So they ran across. They got hit pretty hard. And some actually made it to the other side and jumped in a Marine fault cells, but they got wiped out. So the company commander, this company commander was at Nomahan, and he goes, okay, I'm just going to wait I'll bring some our heavy guns up, bring machine guns up. So obviously there's a lot of Americans got a lot of firepower over there. Let's just bring machine guns up. Let's bring our two 70 millimeter infantry guns up. Then we'll provide a base of fire support, because that was Japanese tactics. Provide a fire support base, hit them with supporting arms, then move up close and use their strength of close combat, which they loved. The speed, surprise, stealth, the close combat, and engage the enemy, because they didn't think the Americans or any enemy liked close combat. So that was the whole Japanese tactics. Either infiltrate, get them in close combat, and hit them hard. So at that stage, they're waiting. Now Ichiki comes up. Ichiki speaks to this captain. Captain advises Ichiki, this is what we got, sir. This company's got... No, sorry, I take that back. The battalion commander, major, comes up. This is before Ichiki comes. And he goes, sir, this is what we got. Battalion commander says, let me go check out myself. I'm going to do a personal reconnaissance. So him and his staff officer, I think another went up. They got hit and they're killed. So battalion commander's killed off the bat. Then Ichiki then comes up. He goes, what do you got? He goes, well, first platoon got wiped out. There's a lot of American firepower. The battalion commander's dead. And Ichiki goes, instead of thinking, this is what I suggest, sir, let's wait till the guns come up. Ichiki goes, nope, we'll push your company over. So they pushed the second company over, or the rest of the company over, and yeah, they were all shot down. Then Ichiki says, okay, I should have listened, but they're telling me the truth. Okay, second company, before I send you over, let me bring the guns up. So he brought 8 heavy machine guns up, and they tried to bring the 2 70 millimeter infantry guns up. They brought one up, because you remember these things are man-packed, so it takes a while to get them up there. One was stuck in the sand. So yeah, they started firing a base of fire and support fire and the best they could. And then what Ichiki wanted to do, instead of going across the mouth of the river, which that was a death zone, he goes, okay, I'll send the engineers in the next company. We'll go upstream and push across the river, because this is Alligator Creek's a tidal lagoon. At that stage, it was over their heads. The chests were over their heads. So yeah, his next assault tried to go across the river then, and it didn't. It met with failure also.
How were the Marines laid out on the ground to defend, and what sort of manoeuvre were they performing then in response to Ichiki's attack?
So initially it was at night, and they had a strong defensive line set up. They had the barbed wire, and I think I mentioned in another episode. Well, the barbed wire they only offloaded 28 spools of barbed wire, so they were using a coconut plantation wire, the civilian wire, and they'd had a couple of strands over the mouth of the sandbar, one end, one on the other. But they'd had coconut log bunkers they'd built in. They took 2 of their anti-tank guns, and they faced them toward the sandbar. They had a 50 cal on the sandbar. like 100 meters to the 100 yards to the right was a machine gun post with a 30 caliber heavy machine gun, the Brown and water cools, and then they had 2 or 3 more up the river from that. They had the place pre-registered on it for a 75 millimeter artillery battery. They pre-registered that whole area. They had 81 millimeters registered. They had 60 millimeter mortars. So they had the whole place wired in, ready to go. They had 2 companies on the river and had another company in reserve ready to back them up. This is from the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, 2-1. So they were ready to go. It was a very strong position because everything's channelized or funneled straight down that 50-foot wide, 100-foot long sandbar, open sandbar. On the other side is just coconut plantation. Oh, in fact, both sides it was open coconut plantations. We can see straight down the roads. Nice and neat.
So in the first large set-piece battle of the Guadalcanal campaign, already the Marines are very competent at developing a combined arms effect.
Well, at that battle, yeah, but in fact, they had some great commanders. They had Clifton Cates, Colonel Clifton Cates. He was the regimental commander, and he was a World War I vet, very famous World War I vet, actually. He'd done quite well in the Battle of Belleau Wood as a company commander. I think I forgot his famous, I think it was day 2 of the battle at one stage. He said he'd made into a village, only something like 10 guys with him. He goes, what's your situation? He goes, I don't have anyone left. He goes, basically that there's no one left, no ammunition. I'm in the village. There's no support to my left, no support to my right, but I will hold. That became quite famous. But he's a pretty tough guy. He was, I think they said during that battle that night, he had Pollock too, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock. He was the battalion commander. He was a pretty switched on guy too. So I think once Cates gave his orders, he said, do this, send the reserve company up. He goes, call in the 75s. He goes in, wait in the morning. He said, just hold. He told battalion commander, he said, just hold. And in the morning, we'll wipe them out. Because he had his 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, his reserve battalion, ready to go. They're going to do development the next morning. He said, just hold them. And the next morning, we'll kill them all. We'll wipe them out. Then apparently he sat back in his chair and lit a cigarette and just kicked back a bit. Yeah, pretty cool guy.
It's good to have that confidence.
Yeah, he was. He probably thought, well, this is nothing compared to the Great War, the War I. Yeah.
So August 20, there's 31 aircraft that land on Henderson Airfield from the USS Long Island, and 2 days later there's some P-400 Airacobras. What sort of impact did they have on the fighting in the battle?
Not so much impact in the fighting, but the impact on the morale and the whole impact for the campaign was just phenomenal. Because basically what these guys did, you had the unsinkable aircraft carrier. Because the 1st Engineer Battalion had basically completed the airfield officially by the 16th of August. There was actually a PBY Catalina landed on the 12th, and that's another story. It snuck in there and landed. He was a Navy flyer. But anyway, so it was ready to go. So the plane started landing on the 20th. So there were 18 Wildcats and 12 SBD dive bombers, so 2 squadrons. So they landed. As soon as they landed, the Marines were like weeping and jumping up and down because support had finally arrived. So that really changed the campaign because at that stage, the Japanese had ruled they could unload their ships in day and night at free will. They had total control of the sea space around Guadalcanal. But once those planes arrived, that unsinkable aircraft carrier, now you had a force that potentially could dominate the sea or can very much well contest the sea space and the airspace around it. Because the bombers were flying, Japanese bombers are doing their daily runs at 20,000 feet and bombing the airfield and the Tojo time, they call it. But now you had something that it could fight back. And the Marines' morale boosted dramatically. So their contribution to the battle, the next day, when the daylight came, there was some Japanese around and the Wildcats did their strafing runs. So they didn't really contribute much to that battle. But for the overall campaign, it was just amazing and huge impact.
So after daylight, they really sort of... How many Japanese are left at daybreak?
It's hard to tell.
Got?
Well, Ichiki at that stage, they'd done a third assault. And the third assault, they said, well, we can't go through the river. We tried to go through the river. It's too deep. Tried to go across the sandbar, and we just got wiped out. So typical Japanese infiltration techniques, they're trying to infiltrate around, but there's really not much to infiltrate. So they said, well, let's just go. And they went, the third wave at night went out into the surf and tried to circumvent or come around the sandbar. But you got to remember, the Marines had an L shape. So down the Ilu and to the left was all down the coastal defenses. So they had machine gun bunkers and anti-tank bunkers. So the Japanese tried to infiltrate around, which they did. They come straight into the 70 or 80 meters down. They come straight into the other machine guns and basically got wiped out. There's a famous Time Life photo. I remember seeing it when I was a kid, the very first time, and I had a Time Life World War II books. And it shows these Japanese, look like they're sleeping, dead Japanese, and they got sand. They're like in the sand, and they're like they're sleeping. So that was that group. It got wiped out. So when the morning time come, the Japanese were they were disorganized, and I think the Marines basically said they're kind of like moving around, and they really wasn't making any organized attempts or organized efforts. So just like Kate said, in the morning we'll get them out of there. I think he actually said we're not going to let them hold up there all day. We're going to wipe them out, get them out. So he sends one battalion to do a flank. So they went down to the south of the river, 1,000 yards down, and they basically started flanking the Japanese, enveloping them to the Japanese left flank or the southern flank. At the same time, they started pounding the Japanese, because Japanese were caught in the Coconut Grove, and they started pounding them with the mortars, and the 75 millimeter artillery started pounding them. The Wildcats were strafing them. Some of the Japanese were trying to escape out to sea, and at that stage it was daylight. Marines were shooting them in the ocean. At one stage, they sent 5 M2 tanks, tank platoon from A Company, the 1st Tank Battalion. They sent them over the sandbar with the Marines platoon, and they started taking out the Japanese there in the tank infantry assault. And the enveloping battalion basically closed in, so they wiped the Japanese out of the pocket. They left 125 Japanese back at the base, reserve base, as a rear guard. They captured something like 15 Japanese, and 30 Japanese made it back to the rear guard. So roughly about 800 Japanese died. 2,750, 800 Japanese died in that attack. So basically wiped the whole unit out. To the man, all died. None wounded. They didn't suffer 30% casualty. They suffered 90% casualty.
And American casualties?
Total about 41 dead. I forget the number off the head wounded. I never say only. I hate that term. Only 1 dead or only 2 dead. It's not really respectful, especially if you're one of the 1 or 2 dead.
Absolutely. So once again, they're using armor in the attack, and Vandergriff wrote that the rear of the tanks look like meat grinders. So it gives you an idea of just how fierce the fighting was and how confined the Japanese positions were. And
also, too, the meat grinder, because they had to go across the sandbar. And there were just stacks and stacks of bodies there. Colonel James, Caper James, was the chief of staff. He was kind of like booted out in September. But there's a guy called Carl Sewell, and he was the division's photographer officer. There's some famous photos of the Alligator Creek when the Japanese dead. But Sewell says he was going to take the photos of the Japanese dead on the sandbar. And they were basically, you can imagine, getting hit point blank range with canister shots from 37 millimeter cannons. I mean, these things fired 128 30 caliber lead steel balls straight out, and you're running straight in that, and it's just bits and pieces. So there was just mangled bodies all over the place. James told him, remember, this is the first battle they've fought, and this is the very start of the war. He goes, don't take photos of those. They're too graphic, too gruesome. We can't take photos of them. So take photos of these guys over here, of the group that infiltrated, and they were hit with machine gun rifle fire, so not blew to pieces. And plus also at that stage, the tanks had drove over a lot of the bodies on the sandbar, and they were in bits and pieces too. So that's just a little side fact about Guadalcanal a lot of people don't know about. And Sewell actually said this, because one of my friends used to know him quite well and used to correspond with him all the time.
So the Marines, all of the elements of combined arms, what did both sides take out of the battle? Like, did the Japanese learn anything from this, and how did the Marines develop their fighting techniques for the future battles?
In the scheme of things, on the scale of other battles in the Guadalcanal campaign, the Battle of Tenaru or Alligator Creek, whatever you want to call it, was a small localized battle. I mean, it was only a battalion level fight. They never fought in that area again. But the impact it had, especially combined with the Getchy Patrol, lasted throughout the war. Basically showed, because you've seen it in the Pacific, HBO's Pacific series shows a good example, but after the battle, when the Marines are moving through, and the Navy corpsmen are trying to tend to some of the Japanese wounded, and they're trying to take some of the Japanese prisoners. Well, the Japanese wouldn't surrender, but when they did kind of surrender, sometimes they blow themselves up with hand grenades or try to kill Americans with hand grenades. So at that stage, the Americans had really encountered the Japanese not surrendering. I mean, yeah, Tulagi, they did. But you got to remember, a lot of American information coming back, it wasn't coming back because the Americans had been fighting the Japanese were either prisoners or dead. Then a lot of the information hadn't been filtering back. So this is kind of the first times Americans are really experiencing the Japanese fighting and the Japanese capacity to not surrender and not take prisoners. That started to set the tone. That and especially the Gauge Patrol. The Gauge Patrol, remember, they're not taking prisoners and they'll butcher you and they're not surrendering. Then you had the tricky, quote, Japanese at Alligator Creek and blow themselves up and try to kill you. So it set the stage. They said, good, these guys are not taking prisoners. They're not surrendering, so we'll kill them all. We won't take prisoners either. And that was kind of the unwritten rule. And that was a bit of an eye-opener for the Americans, the Marines, or the Americans, especially the Marines. And also proved is a big confidence builder for the Marines, especially the 1st Marine Regiment, because I think we discussed in the first episode, this regiment was about 70% brand new green recruits. This is their first fight for most of them. And these guys, remember, they graduated boot camp in January, April. They had a little bit of training. They're on shifts. And this is August. 6 months later, they're fighting the basically an elite. I don't use fanatical for Japanese, but very determined, disciplined troops, highly trained. And these are just green kids, but in defense positions backed up with modern weapons, with good leadership. So, yeah, and it's a great boost for them. It was actually a great blooding, as you want to call it, for these guys to fight in a defensive position. So if they're on the offensive, it might be a different story, but this is a good confidence boost. And also it's a confidence boost for the morale of the American public. This is the first time that fought the Japanese and defeated the Japanese. So this is the first, the whole Japanese base wiped out. The whole battalion was wiped out. These guys had never met defeat. This is August the 21st. They'd never met defeat yet. So this is a bit of a big morale boost for the American public. Japanese, initially when the report started coming back from the rear guard, they radioed back and said they're being annihilated. The Japanese thought, well, that can't be true. It's obviously false information. These guys don't know what they're talking about. So after about 2 or 3 days, it started working out. Hey, these guys are wiped out. So it made the Japanese think, okay, well, maybe we need to send more troops out, which they had them en route. So remember, Kawaguchi and his 35th Brigade, these are the guys who initially was going into Port Moresby, or the Port Moresby campaign, 35th Brigade. So they were diverted from that campaign to go, and the 4th was diverted too. So they're all diverting from New Guinea to going into Guadalcanal. So, yeah, the Japanese said, well, okay, now we'll get whatever we got there and take these guys back. But they still haven't recognized that their strategic value, they'd recognized strategic value, but hadn't recognized the Americans had intended to fight. This is where the Americans had intended to fight. The Japanese hadn't really clued on at that stage. The Americans had drew a line in the sand. This is where they wanted to do their attritional fight right now.
So what happened to Ichiki then?
Yeah, that's another controversy, or one of those we don't exactly know. So the report that came back, or the one you read quite often, either killed himself or he died in battle. I tend to think he died in battle. The Japanese version during the war was Ichiki, due to the loss of his regiment and loss of face, he did the honorable thing, committed seppuku, what they call it. Basically killed himself. And before he did that, he burned the colors, the regimental colors, then he killed himself. So that was the wartime narrative, and that became kind of accepted after the war. But then some of the survivors, and their accounts after the war, basically stated that I think there's like 4 survivors on 4 different accounts, said the last they seen Ichiki was late in the morning, or late that evening, early in the morning, however you want to say it, about 4 o'clock during the last assault, the 3rd assault, they seen Ichiki going forward toward the fight, and no one reported him coming back. So I tend to believe he died in battle. He died in that last assault. Now, one, it goes in line with his character, leading from the front, died at the front of his men, very aggressive. I think he led the last charge. He died. Also, the state of the Japanese when sunlight came. They're basically someone's like chickens with their heads cut off. They had no direction, no guidance, no control. No one was in control. If you know how the Japanese were, if you take out officers and some of the senior NCOs, they're kind of like that whole centralization of command. They're kind of lost. And they were. And that was what the reports were coming back. The eyewitnesses said these Japanese were out of control. And that's another evidence to suggest he died. Now, there's one witness account. He says at one stage in the morning, he's seen 3 officers standing by a tree. And one shoots himself, then the other shoots himself. And then the other one kills him, buries him. Then he goes over to assist and bury him. He says they wasn't wearing any tunics, but they all had officers' pants. 2 of them had officers' pants. So he thinks that one was Ichiki and one was Ichiki's aide or staff officer, and the other one was a senior NCO. So he helped bury him by a tree. So potentially that could have been it too. But the burning of the colors, now we know that's not true by Ichiki because each Japanese regiment had a color bearer. And it goes back to, the American Civil War and whatever, the color bearer, color guards. And that was their whole job, is to bear the colors. And the Japanese, in the reports, they had like a little device had magnesium in it. And it was designed to burn the colors very quickly if they need to. So these colors, the 20th Regiment apparently had got what heel was, but in 1905 Russian-Japanese War, the regiment took this heel and it broke the back of the whatever. But anyway, the same flag they carried at Alligator Creek was carried there. And plus everyone defended to the last. And what apparently this guy did, the color guard, he used that thing of magnesium, burned the flag, and then on the remnants of the flag, he took a hand grenade and he basically laid over it and blew himself up over the remnants of the flag. So that's more believable because Ichiki's not going to be carrying the flag around. So whether he died at battle or died by his own hand, who knows? But he certainly died. And that's like I said earlier, he learned his first and last lesson on the modern combined arms.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. A fascinating story about the Battle of the Tenaru. A lot to learn, and we will return to look at Edson's Ridge.
Yeah, that would be a good one to go over. Looking forward to that one.
Alrighty. Thank you very much. Once again, a massive thanks to Dave Holland for his expertise. You can tell that not only does he understand what happened in each of the battles and why, but he also understands the context of each of the battles in this large Guadalcanal campaign. Keep an eye out for his book, The Battles of the Matanacao. When it's released, it's going to be well worth reading. Lastly, if you see any of our social media content, please like and share it. It helps us get the word out about the Principles of War podcast. If you're using it for professional military education, drop me a line. I'm really keen to hear how you're using it in the PME programs that are out there. And that's it. We'll be back next week with the Battle of Edson's Ridge.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.